Righty. Welcome today. We have a pretty good lesson here today because rather than dealing with a specific question, I kind of want to talk about the foundation of all questions. That way, when we are navigating those questions, we kind of have a roadmap to refer back to. So this is going to kind of be the baseline video. And this is basically like why your life is the way it is and how to change it. And basically, we're just talking about the substance of reality and how it works. And I'm going to try and break it down as simple as possible. So let's just jump right into it. So basically, in order to understand how life works, right, it's really composed of a couple of things. Three things, really. Your being, right? Your thinking, and then your emotional response to that. And then everything, once you have this idea of your being distilled into your thinking and then distilled through your emotions, you then create what is called physical reality. But physical reality is really just, it's not reality. It's just the last stage of reality as it's materialized, right? So you might be like, well, what's an example of that? Well, say for instance, like I want to go pick this bottle up, right? So when I was picking this bottle up, I had to think, I want to pick up this bottle. And then I had the thought that came through me. So first it came through my being, I had the thought, then there's the emotion of just wanting to prove it or do it, whatever. But all of this is happening so fast we don't think about it. And then boom, it comes into physical reality. So when we have larger phenomena that we're trying to create in our lives or that are happening in life, we can typically start noticing the time scales of which that happens. Say, for instance, you have a goal in mind. You have this goal that is in your mind, right? This is happening at the thinking stage. And then in order to do that, your being has to be in alignment, obviously, because the thought wouldn't have come to something that was out of alignment. And then you have to have emotions, right? Because emotions are what drive motion. It's what creates action, right? It's why oftentimes when we don't feel motivated, it's coming from a place where there's emotional stagnation. That's because the level of being hasn't been fully integrated, but we'll talk about that. And then obviously when you have being, you have thinking, and you have your emotions all the way tapped in, boom, then you have physical reality, right? And it might even be more appropriate to switch emotions at the top here and then have being at the bottom. But we're going to go in through all of that. But basically, we're going to talk about why things work the way they work in the most basic sense, but then really once you understand the roadmap of how all this works, you can then extrapolate it out into larger things. So let's just get into it. So the biggest thing here is just we're going to start trying to understand basically where we are in order to understand where we want to go. Just like anything, if I want to walk across the room, I have to see I'm here in one place, and then where am I going relative to the place I want to go, right? And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, you're going to be like, oh, where did you learn this? It was a lot of reading, a lot of studying, and a lot of just different resources that obviously you guys won't have to peruse through. You can if you want, and I'll give references for all of this stuff. But ultimately, you don't have to necessarily believe everything that I share. It's just important that you experiment and kind of just trust yourself and your own judgment, as well as the process of the experimentation, right? Because we're going to talk about a couple of things you can do and some things you've probably definitely heard of that can help you understand the nature of everything we're going to talk about today. So yeah, want to make sure we're still recording. Okay, so the best way to explain this is the universe, right? Or just as reality. You can basically divide reality up into 7 different layers, right? And so these 7 layers you could call I call it the 7 degrees, like 7th degrees of the universe, right? Or 7 degrees of law is what I call it. And law basically is just like, this is how the universe works, right? So there are 7 different layers. Now, what do I mean when I say there's layers? So let's just take it, the universe is like a giant circle. So everything that is, everything that will be, everything that exists within this singular moment that you have as an idea of the past going into the future just exists in this giant circle, right? And everything outside of it as well, right? Just exists. Everything is. Now what happens is you can take this singular circle, and then you can divide it once, right? And when you divide it once, this is second degree law. And so let's actually build that up here. So basically, here, when it's just a giant circle, we have first degree law, right? That's everything is connected, everything is one. And that's the idea that everything is connected and is just giant blob. But there's no distinction if everything is just this giant blob. So we draw a distinction down the line, right? And now we have a difference. So you could call this, darkness, light, whatever. But now you have two different things that are creating contrast. And this is called second degree law, right? And when you have second degree law, now this creates a contrast, a difference, right? Then let's say you change it again because now you need to have a balance between second degree and third degree. So you have now what's called third degree law. Now, first, second, and third degree, there's just the same amount of corresponding laws. At first degree law, you have love, right? Basically everything is love. And I know you guys might think this is very abstract. I don't understand what you're talking about here. I promise it'll make sense. Just stick with me here, right? It's just important that you understand everything is connected all at once. You can call this love, you can call this truth, you can call it whatever. Then at the second degree, when everything gets divided, and now there's difference, there's contrast, you can call it like gender or masculine polarity. I don't want to use the word gender, but it's just the idea of masculine and feminine energy, positive, negative, light, dark, up, down, like just opposites, right? Second dimension kind of stuff, right? And then once you get to third degree, right? Now we live in a three-dimensional universe, right? This is where you start seeing things pop into physical reality. And this is where you start having basically union, right? And union is based in three fundamental truths. So justice, grace, and mercy. And you might hear that and be like, well, Oni, this sounds like too good to be true. This sounds perfectly put together, super organized. Real life doesn't function like that. You're right. And it's because most people are not operating or see reality in first, second, or third degree law. They are only perceiving law at seventh degree. So what happens is basically as you continue to make divisions down this sort of pie, so to speak, right? What happens is you begin to get decisions. So at fourth degree law, you begin to factor. Now you mean fourth degree means there's four laws, right? Because there's one law here, two laws here, three laws here. But at fourth degree, you start getting a fracture, right? And that fracture, because of it, now there's five laws, right? And you can call these the law of covenant, right? If you want that. It's basically the idea that we make promises, we keep promises, and then things happen, right? So I'm going to pick this up because I've decided to pick it up. I'm able to pick it up, right? I put it down, I'm able to put it down. And then there's all these laws that work in conjunction with that. Now, every single physical law, whether it be gravity, electricity, the way air works, everything is based within these foundational laws. But they begin to become less and less abstract and more concrete as you come farther down. So if you think about it, it's almost like there's this giant pool or reservoir of water, just unfiltered truth at the top. And then as it begins to come down and trickle down, it goes through these different layers of definition. And as it goes through these layers of definition, the amount of elements within it begin to be pulled out and separated. A good example of this, right, when we talk about 7 degrees, is light through a prism, right? So when light rays go through a prism, we got our little prism there, right? You get singular one light rays come out, but then after that you get, different colors that come out. And obviously I don't have all the colors of the rainbow as markers. Maybe I need to get those, right? But the idea is that different colors come out. So one light goes in, first degree law or love, the whole thing. But then as it comes through and is shined through the prism, you could call this prism life, right? Or reality. What happens when you have the inner world and the outer world collide? Then you have life here, experiences, right? We have experiences, thinking. So everything I'm going to be talking about is broken down into these basic steps. because we live in a third dimension, a lot of the ways we're going to see being, emotions, and our thinking is going to be in those 3 layers, right? So stick with me here. And then, so once you get to 4th degree law, you have 4th degree. Once you get to 4th degree law, you actually have 5 laws. Once you get to 5th degree law, you actually have 7 laws. And then once you get to 6th degree law, you have 12 laws. And then once you get to 7th degree, you actually have an infinite amount of laws. That's why if you always try to understand this from the bottom up, you're going to basically try to learn an infinite amount of laws to try and understand 12 basic ones. And then you're going to try to understand those 12 basic ones so you can understand these 7 ones. And then from understanding those 7 ones, you're going to try and come to understand these 5 laws. And then if you come to understand these 5 laws, you're going to understand these 3 laws, justice, grace, and mercy. And then from there, you're then going to understand the law of polarity, union, gender, whatever, right? Basically that there's just 2 fundamental forces, right? These, you can call this 2nd degree one, masculine, feminine energy, or as I like it, there's terms that was coined by a great guy called Cleon Skousen. Cleon Skousen, really cool guy, really smart. And basically he called these fundamental units of life matter, we all know that, right? And then intelligence. And then that's it. And so once you have this convolution, this confluence, so this coming together of matter and intelligence, boom, you get reality, you get life, and then a bunch of things start to happen, right? And then when all of these come together, they all come from love, right? And you can call this God, you can call this mind, you can call this the universe, whatever. Really, at the end of the day, it's all just energy, right? It's all just energy. Just energy in different forms, in different frequencies, in different steps, right? So that's really the basics of everything we're going to kind of talk about today. I promise I'm going to try and keep it under an hour. But basically, we're going to be running through, I'm going to give examples of what each of these layers of law mean. What are the basis you can understand that? And basically tell you that your life will reflect the level of law you live. So that's a really, really big phrase. And I'm actually going to write that down because that's a big thing to say. So anyway, if you're liking what you're seeing so far, don't hesitate to like and subscribe to my channel. I need all the viewers I can get. And I'm trying to build out and help as many people as possible. So trying to get this stuff out. And if you need help in applying these laws or understanding them in your own life, feel free to reach out to me. I have a link down below and we can talk about how you can better apply these laws. And if you want, see life in a better way. But I digress. Let's now talk about what I actually mean when I say you will get the results of the law you live. So let me give an example. You guys ever know how there's some people who no matter what happens, they always have like a good outlook on life, like just something bad could happen, and then they I'll give an example. There's this story about a man who was a farmer, and then one day he had his horse, and his horse got lost. And he went and told his neighbor, and his neighbor told him like, hey man, that's a pretty bad thing that happened to you. And the man said, I don't know, maybe so, I guess we'll wait and see. And then the horse came back, but there was a bunch of horses. And now this guy had so many horses, he was able to get more work done, right? And they said, wow, losing that horse was a good thing. You had so many. I guess we'll wait and see. And then he was like, and he told his neighbor, then he's like, maybe, yes, no, maybe so. I guess we'll wait and see. Then, while he was working on the farm, he had his son, and his son was helping him tend all the horses or whatever. But one day, a bunch of the horses ran over his son and ended up breaking his son's leg. And they're like, oh my God, I guess all those horses coming into your life ended up hurting your son, and that's not a good thing. And he says, yes, no, maybe so. I guess we'll wait and see. And then a couple of months later went by, there was a war happening. Oh, I guess they're plastic on this. I didn't even know that. I just bought this, so no clue. Anyway, my ADD. So the man goes and basically is like, oh no, my son's been ran over by all these horses. And so then as a result of that, he was sad, he was mourning. But then a few months later, there was a giant war that happened in the man's country. And then because of that, the boy was not able to get drafted because they were drafting all eligible young men. But because the boy had been injured, he wasn't able to go off to war. And this war was so devastating, so bad, that the chances of the young man surviving would have been minimal. But because he had his leg broken by the horses, he survived. And then the neighbor came up to the dad, and you know what he said. I guess those horses breaking your son's leg was a good thing. And then the man said, yes, no, maybe so. I guess we'll wait and see. So what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story is that something happening one way or another isn't necessarily good or bad. It's about how we interpret it, right? And given time, we'll oftentimes get the option to pick. And so this is what I mean when I say the layer or degree of law you live by will dictate your reality. This is why some things, for instance, like there was a time when I was I was heartbroken, so I was a bit of a misogynist. I'll definitely, I can admit it. I'm man enough to admit it that I wasn't necessarily in the best place with the ladies. And so as a result of that, every interaction I had with them and with women was always really, really negative, right? And a lot of that was just coming from a bunch of mommy issues that I had. And so because I hadn't resolved those mommy issues, when I was relating to women, I was living at a lower degree of law. And in these lower degrees of law, there's a lot of feelings that are based in pain, based in suffering, based in guilt. And so as a result of that, that was my experience. And so everything that I put out, I called that in. A lot of people call that the law of attraction, but that's only one of 12 universal laws, right? But that's essentially it at play. Like you get what you put out after it. Another example I'd like to think about is think of life like a giant coffee cup, right? So I'm gonna make a coffee cup here. So let's say I have a coffee cup, and inside this coffee cup, I put a bunch of red coffee. It's delicious, right? But it's got a very bitter taste to it or whatever. Now, if someone comes in and pours water into this, right? I'm not going to get water and I'm not going to get coffee. I'm going to get a diluted form of both, which in and of itself, like red and blue, they'll make purple. You'll get a completely different experience, right? So this is why we can, for instance, experience love directly from people, but it doesn't necessarily change us or have the effect as what is intended because our cups are filled with other things rather than what we're receiving. So the universe can give us one thing, life can give us one thing, but because of the residue or what's already in our cup, we then change that experience. So in order to get a purity of reality and move it towards what we want, we have to make sure that we take the things that the universe wants that is in line with what we want, as well as make sure that what we want is also inside our cup, right? So we have to make sure that the receiver is aligned with the giver. But the giver, remember, so the giver is just the universe, right? And I'm spelling it on purpose this way, right? It's just you. You are the universe, right? And so as you receive, so shall you give and vice versa. So it's really important to understand that the layer or degree of law you live by will dictate your reality. Most people are living a 7th degree law. They have no clue. They don't have access to the higher layers, right? They can't even think or understand them. They don't live by them. So 7th degree law is things like politics, religion, racism, just all these things that are very nuanced and seem very complicated, because the nature of 7th degree law is that it is complex. And when something is complex, it is confusing. When something is confusing, and then you might be like, well, that's confusing because that's reality and it can't be that simple. And it's like, yeah, of course not, because that's the layer you're living in. You're choosing to interpret reality through this complex, confusing lens. And so that is why you are confused by it. So the layer or degree of law you live by will dictate your reality. You live by a complex set of rules that are confusing, so therefore you have a very complex, confusing life. Right? So some people, for instance, will have all these ideas and these ideologies, and they'll be like, man, like I just hate this thing. Like I hate like white people. I hate like black people. I just hate people. I hate. And they're just so mad and they're just so hateful. And then they're like, man, I hate my life. I'm depressed. Everything is so wrong. The world is just this terrible place, right? But they don't realize like that feeling is reflecting in their thinking, and then that thinking is reflecting into their reality, because we don't receive our reality, we create it, right? Human beings, we're creators of our reality. And if you don't believe me, I want you guys just do a small little action, right? Do a small little action. Move your hand up and down if you can, or put the phone down and then look back up at the screen. If you can get this far, you realize you're able to start manipulating and doing even small little interactions in your reality. Just making sure that we're still going. So as a result of that, we see that we can take these little things, right? But like anything else, it's from small and simple things, great things come to pass, right? And I'm going to show you how that kind of works at the higher, upper layers of reality, right? So let's actually get into a basic diagram of being, so that as we move in through go through all these laws, everything will make sense. So, but it's really important for you guys to understand this basic sentiment. If you want to say, well, this is how I feel about life, this is what I think about life because this is reality, okay, then that is reflective of the degree of law you live by. And if you feel things like complexity, confusion, shame, guilt, apathy, like a lot of these sort of lower emotional paradigms, you're living by 7th degree law, which is what most people live by. Don't blame yourself, right? I would say probably about 80% of the world lives by that. It's a standard deviation curve, right? So standard deviation, right? Most people here live in 7th degree law. And then you have 10% of people living higher degrees of law. That's it. So yeah, and that's why you have the Pareto principle, right? So the Pareto principle is the 80-20 rule. And that's where 80% of results are created by 20% of the people. And it's because once you live by higher law, you have so much more energy and resources to your capacity, because life begins to simplify, right? And it begins to simplify so much that you're now able to do things that most people would just dream about, not because you're better, not because you figured something out that somebody else didn't know where to figure out, but because you are living by laws that are simpler and more powerful, and therefore they dictate your reality. So they create a simpler, more powerful reality. It's just as simple as that. So the reality you live by is going to be reflective of the laws you live by. So let's talk about what those laws are and what to change it, okay? So now let's go into just essentially being, right? So being, because you're a third dimensional being, as a human being, coming down into physical reality, you are what would be called a third degree entity, right? You exist as a third degree entity. So yes, there's first and second degree entities. There's also fifth, sixth, fourth, seventh degree entities, right? And all of reality can be stacked up like that. And so there's different entities at these different levels, right? You, being a third degree entity, you have 3 essential faculties, right? So you have what we would call a spirit. Now, spirit just means something which exists beyond the mind and the body. And you might be like, well, what do you mean beyond the mind and the body? The example is like, can you give me a thought? Can you give me a thought for anger? Right? Is anger a thought or is it a feeling? Right? And if you think of a feeling, how would you characterize a feeling beyond that, a feeling? What is the faculty which feels? Right? Now, the physical faculty, you could call it your heart or body, whatever. But in terms of those feelings, right, what you're talking about then is spirit, right? So spirit is perceived through your feelings, right? And it's the fundamental foundation of what you are, right? Then, here in the middle, we have mind, right? Your mind is perceived through your thoughts. Or rather, your thoughts are perceived with your mind, right? So you're basically spirit, and then you're basically mind. So you have thoughts, you have feelings, right? And these all exist inside of you, right? Or really outside of you, but we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then finally, at the very end, you have your body. And then you have your feelings, you have your thoughts, and then we can call this your being, or really your actions. But we're going to call this being because most people see as how you're living here, right? So your feelings, your thoughts, then come into your body, your being, because it all distills down. And then it comes into physical reality, right? So this is the physical, this is the mental, and the spirit is the spiritual. Now again, I don't mean spiritual being like, oh, it's religious and like, I pray to God or like I have namaste beads. No. We're just talking about basic, like really like basic, this is just how it works. These are just the mechanics of what's going on, right? It's not something that has to have a narrative placed on it. Because what I'm trying to teach you guys is really just about go experiment with this, go understand it, see if it's true or not true, and then there's no narrative that I'm going to place on you here. We all have our own different narratives here. I'm not trying to sell you a narrative, right? This isn't like some cult teaching. There's a lot of religions, politics. There's a lot of people who will try and tell you a narrative of what all this means. You get to decide what that means. That's not really my place to say. I'm just saying that mechanically, this is how life functions. And if you start looking at life this way, things are going to start making more sense. And they're going to make more sense because instead of living at this confusing, well, everything's just so complicated and we don't know and arguing and blah, 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 blah. Instead of living at 7th degree law and being confused all the time, you start living, hopefully, at 3rd degree law. And you'll have simplicity, right? And so at 3rd degree law, you're going to start having union. But we're not going to dive into that yet. But the reason I say 3rd degree law is because you, as a human being, function at 3rd degree law. Now, something that's really important, there's this thing called the Hawkins scale. So Dr. David Hawkins wrote about it. And basically, it measures vibration, tells you about how you're feeling and your emotions at every single level of vibration, right? So the idea is this. As you begin to ascend and have an understanding of the higher dimensions of law, you will then begin to perceive reality more simply, right? Because reality is just going to start making more sense. You can, in an essence, say you're getting smarter, right? And from there, you're going to then be able to have access to higher levels of law. And then when you have access to higher levels of law, you're going to be able to, have a cooler reality, right, that you like. And so spiritual reality is basically dictated at the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd degrees of law, right? Mental reality is at the 4th, 5th, and 6th dimensions of law. And then physical reality, so if you're just trying to understand the world through just physical law, so like gravity, the way people act with chemicals, the way human psychology is a big one that's based in this, right? And a lot of people think psychology is like this big, great thing, but it's like, no, it's really just like here, it's the bridge into here, but it's not really quite mental law. Like psychology is just the illusion of mental law, but it's not really actually how it works, right? But it's still helpful, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but it's just understanding, and I'm going to be using a lot of these frameworks to explain what we learn in psychology, because there's a lot of good psychology there that's based in higher mental law, but most of what psychology is, and most of what psychologists tell you, is really just based in a convolution of seventh degree law. And that's why it ultimately never seems to work. It's why it's a very unpredictable science, right? Because it's just lower degree law. And human beings are third dimensional, we're third degree beings, right? Versus like rocks and tables and like physical matter, that's seventh degree. So it obeys physical law perfectly because that's the law it's meant to operate at, but we're meant to operate at a higher level of law. And if we're not operating at this higher level of law, we're gonna feel this disconnect, right? And that's why we feel these really trashy feelings at the bottom. So when you start living at seventh degree law, if you guys look up the Hawkins scale, you're gonna feel things like shame. You're gonna feel guilt. You're gonna feel apathy. And then as you get higher, you're gonna feel fear. Fear is a big one. A lot of people feel fear. And then you're gonna feel desire. And then as you start getting higher up and you start getting into the mental plane, you're gonna then start moving into things like pride and then courage, which is a really big one because courage is the last physical or negative emotion and the first positive emotion together. It's like a bridge emotion, right? So courage is really big in your personal narrative. Then as you start moving into courage, that's why courage also aligns with the heart, but you're gonna see as we go into that later. And so as you start moving up the scale, you're gonna have things like willingness, reason, neutrality is gonna be down here, right? But you're just gonna start having a more awakened mind. You're gonna things are gonna start making more sense, and you're not gonna feel so much fear because you're gonna have understanding of things, right? And so because you have this understanding of things, because your mind is more enlightened, you're gonna start seeing things, you're gonna be able to study things, you're gonna be open your mind, right? And then you're gonna start being able to create results. You're gonna start being able to interact with reality because you're no longer operating at this level of fear, desire, apathy, guilt, shame, like 80% of the world is, right? Because you're not just basing your entire life off of this flawed, fractured seventh degree law, because you can't know or understand an infinite amount of laws, right? So literally think about trying to juggle 1,000 different things all at once, or talk about an infinite number of things. That obviously creates these feelings, right? You can't do that, right? Especially when you're meant to operate very simply. So we feel that. Then as we start moving farther up the scale, we start feeling pride, we start feeling courage, neutrality, willingness, reason, right? Now, once you start getting into third degree law, like the way you're meant to, because you're a human being, and human beings, well, maybe you're not a human being. Maybe there's a cat watching this or whatever. But even, I think cats and stuff, those are like second degree, but whatever. So once you start moving into these higher ones, right, and you really start having integration of your feelings, now you're going to start feeling things like joy. You're going to start feeling things like love. And then you're going to feel things like peace, right? And then this comes from basically living at these higher dimensions of law, right? And don't worry, I'll get into the laws. You're going to, as Nero says, you're going to get some. But it's really important to understand why it is we want to even go on this journey of trying to discover what any of this means. Because the idea is we're always going to operate at that level. Most people that we're like, oh man, these guys are so successful, they're so great. If you can get to the place in your life where you're operating in mental law, you're going to see a humongous amount of change in your life. You're going to probably get richer, you're going to be able to build things, you're going to be able to do whatever you want. You might not necessarily feel great all the time doing it, because you're going to be very much in bro mode. It's a lot of masculine energy. It's how you break through. It's that mental plane, right? Because thoughts is just pure intelligence. It's just like, blah, 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 just demand, testosterone, It's very mental, right? A lot of force here, right? But you start moving into out of that getting by. And then once you start getting the feelings, beautiful surrender, oh my God. It's like the powerful feminine, right? It's pure matter and energy right at the top, right? It's enlightenment, it's peace, it's all this stuff. But really what it is This is the masculine, and when the masculine starts to combine with the feminine, this is what you start getting in the mental, right? And then the pure feminine is this matter, right? But obviously, we have to see this as a whole. You can't see it in parts. We see it in parts so that I can explain it to you through this phone and that you can understand what's going on and why life is the way it is. Again, I'm not telling you the narrative. So the why isn't the narrative. Like, I don't tell you what's your story and all this. I don't know what your narrative is. But I'm saying if you want to understand the mechanics of what's going on, this is what's going on, right? This is what's going on. So you as an individual just have to decide where I want to live, right? Do I want to live here in shame, guilt, apathy, fear, desire? Do I want to live here in confusion and complexity? Or do I want to start having a bit more clarity, a bit more reason, a bit more neutrality? You might even call it power. But then once you get up here, you start having peace, love, joy, serenity, right? You start having a lot of these higher gauge emotions, right? But yeah, getting up here is rare. There's not a lot of people that are up here, but if you set that as your goal, it can happen, right? But a lot of people say they want to be happy, but they're trying to be happy using this degree of loss, and it just don't fit. That glove don't fit on that hand, right? So if you want to feel these things, you have to be willing to experiment and understand these degree of laws, and you have to drop these ones. Because the thing is, as you master higher degree laws, you will then naturally gain mastery over the lower ones, right? So it's super important to understand the level of life, the level of law you live by will dictate the life you live, your reality. The level of life you live by will dictate reality. Write that in the comments, post your comments down below. Like and subscribe, by the way. I'm thinking of writing a Mr. Reference book about that. I have a really, really good one about stress. You guys can check it out. Put the Amazon link in below, plug for that book. Mr. Reference and Managing Stress. A lot of it was because I was trying to understand and didn't know all this stuff before, so I talked about a lot of ways to manage and kind of up your vibration so you can get into these higher states of consciousness. But I digress, right? Check it out, Mr. Reference, if you want to do that. But now let's go on to actually talking about what are the laws. Like I said, so 7th degree of law, that's an infinite amount of laws, right? So let's just talk about some examples of what that is. I don't want to spend too much time there. And then we can talk about the higher levels of law. I'm going to be pretty brief because this video is already getting pretty long. But I just want you guys to know basically what it is you're looking for and have a roadmap of what you need to understand. And then, you got to do what you got to do. So I've helped a bunch of people. I even made a bit of a game to help people understand this, and I play with them in person. If you can come find me wherever I am, I'll play it with you, right? But if not, you're gonna have to sign me up, pay an extra, or wait till I can come find you because it's really important, right? Anyway, so let's talk about 7th degree law, right? And we're just going to be very brief here. So 7th degree law so let's just talk about here, right? So 7th degree law is going to be anything that is sort of like a man-made construct. So here you're going to have things like politics, you're going to have religion, you're going to have medicine. And the biggest thing is, with some things at 7th degree, it's not bad, right? It's not that it's bad. We live where we have to deal with these elements of 7th degree. It's not that these things are bad or irrelevant or that we don't that. It's that these things are just extensions of higher laws. So if, say, for instance, you can look at politics and understand its extension, where it begins and ends into a higher law, politics will serve you, right? But it's when politics becomes your worldview, and that's the extent of it, you'll understand that this is a small thing fitting in a much bigger whole, right? A much larger box, right? So politics is just one of many, many, many subjects at 7th degree you need to understand to have a complete mastery of life, right? And so obviously having a complete mastery of life at 7th degree is impossible. That's its nature, right? Because you have to start stepping up. But most of the time, you won't even know to explore different degrees of being or reality if you don't even know. If you don't know anything about politics, religion, medicine, let's talk about science. We can even talk about pop culture, right? We can talk about stories, like anything, right? Basically, physical law as well. So once you start getting into things like gravity, thermodynamics, remember, these are just how laws play out within the physical world, right? Even like psychology, human psychology. Lots of it. There's a lot of human psychology that crosses in the mental plane. So psychology is just the blanket term, right? But a lot of everything we're doing operates at these higher levels of law, but when broken down and distilled, they're, they seem separate, right? But the idea is that if you understand what the higher laws are, you'll start understanding the connections between politics, religion, medicine, science, pop culture, stories, gravity, thermodynamics, psychology, and you just thousands, literally like billions and billions of things. Everything that exists around you is operating under some type of seventh degree law. And if you understand how all those things are connected, you will then jump into sixth degree law. Now, sixth degree law can basically be divided into 12s, right? And so in order to understand sixth degree law, you can use a bunch of different frameworks. Now, some frameworks are more confusing than others, right? And a lot of people aren't going to like this. They're going to call this a pseudoscience, right? Because it's not based in like physical reality. And yet, it's effective nonetheless and been around. So examples of something that's like a sixth degree system is like astrology, right? The Chinese zodiac. Now, I'm not talking about necessarily how effective our understanding of these things are, right? Because once again, I don't necessarily look at astrology and be like, oh my God, that's the bend all that stuff is true, horoscopes. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is astrology is what is it? I don't want to call it a bastardization, but it's a system that was based in sixth degree law that didn't necessarily, that has come together and built off of that. Another actually good, and here's an example of a more modern system, the AA, Alcoholics Anonymous 12 Steps, right? This is an example of that. Our calendar is an example of that, right? And basically showing this rhythm of the universe through these 12 steps, right? Another good one is the hero's journey. Not Joseph Campbell's, I can't remember the other guy's one, but an example of the hero's journey. I use it all the time. I'll make a video about it probably. But these are what we call sixth degree archetypes, or basically patterns of seeing the world, right? And then as you begin to see that, these start to come together. Now there's a fundamental one that I like, and I'm just going to go through them quickly. And these are called the 12 universal laws, right? So these 12 universal laws are basically what I'd come back to if you're ever like, how do I start thinking sixth degree and really start understanding it? Go back to the 12 degrees, 12 universal laws, and then from there, you can build out. So just off the top of my head, that's the law of one. So I'll just write them down. So that's the law of one, the law of correspondence, and I'll make videos kind of describing each of these. So basically, the law of the universe is like the law of one, everything is connected. The law of correspondence, everything as above, so below. Everything in microcosm is in macrocosm. You have the law of vibration, everything is in motion and is vibration and sound. Then you have like the law of attraction, which is basically like things move towards one another, right? Then after that, you have the law of action, Jackson, right? So things have to be moved, there has to be a spark and initiation that creates a reaction, right? And things will then attract to it. Then you have, after the law of action, you have the law of, not cause and effect, you have the law of transmutation, right? Which allows things to transmute, so energy changes but can't be destroyed. It's perpetual and keeps moving. And after that, you have the law of cause and effect, which basically, every cause has an effect. It causes something. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then you have the law of rhythm, which is that everything has a natural rhythm right? Moves in sort of a circular spiral pattern, right? So we tend to go in cycles. Everything moves through cycles. And it's this idea that, the sphere and everything comes together, right? So we have the law of rhythm, then you have the law of polarity, right? Which is that everything is essentially on the same spectrum with everything else. So a good example of polarity is, for instance, like hot things. When is something hot? When is something cold? Right? So we know that 32 degrees Fahrenheit is freezing, 0 degrees Celsius. And then I'm pretty sure it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and I don't know what the Celsius is for boiling. Or it might even be 100 degrees, I don't know, right? But basically, temperature is the spectrum of measurement, but at what point is something hot, is something cold, right? All of this is relative, right? Because we don't know. And that's where you get to the 10th law, the law of relativity, because everything is relative, right? What might be cold over here might be hot over here. What might be very tall over here might be very short over here. It's all just relative, right? So the idea is that there's no absolutes in this sort of game we call life as it kind of expands and goes up. Then here you have the law of I always forget so number 12 is the law of gender, that everything is basically split into masculine and feminine opposites, and that exists on these two diametric poles, and they're always kind of creating this relative tension within each other, and that's what creates this sort of power and attraction to one another. And then that builds and kind of like whoa, 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 and builds. Hold up. Let me make sure I get you guys this life one, because I want to make sure I got you guys. Ooh, I forgot. And so this is actually over here, right? So I did this in order. So once you take out rhythm like that, these are the last 5 laws. So rhythm, polarity, but right here you have what's called the law of compensation. So the law of compensation is that basically, in terms of cause and effect, when you transmute and go put something out there, it's got to come back whatever you put out. So for instance, it's karma, basically. The law of compensation is basically karma, if you know what that is. So put out good, you get good. Put out bad, put bad. But this is where you start going to relativity. What is good? What is bad? Who knows? Who decides? So this is why morality, it's a 7th degree construct. Morality is not real. And you might be like, what do you mean morality is not real? Like, don't you think there's good and bad? There's objectively bad and good things? Well, in the Bible, it talks about how it rains on the just and the unjust, because things like good and bad are things, these are relative terms, right, that we use to describe our experience as individual beings, and based on pleasure, pain, our objectives, our purposes, whatever. And so we call it good or bad. But the reality is that the universe don't give rats. It does not care. And so it will rain on the just and the unjust all alike. Actually, now I'm going to plug another book, one of my favorites. I wrote a fiction book about these 2 girls living in the wasteland. And a big part of that book, The World Girl and the Beast, you can check it out. I'll put it in the link below. A lot of the questions I had about morality came up to me while I was writing that book, because I started to realize that how does one stay loving in an unloving environment would actually compromise your survival, and that might be considered a bad thing, but essential and good in another example. And that was like something that really hit me as I was writing that book, and that really came to my mind. And it was wild, because you just start realizing that morality is really relative, right? So the idea that there's an objective good and an objective bad is really just based in 7th and 6th degree thinking. And 6th degree thinking at a lower level, right? As you ascend and you start mastering all these laws, it's not that morality isn't good, but if you realize the reason morality is that it's trying to speak to the mechanic of the universe that works. And so we have morality, but that mechanic is not always going to play out the way we think it's going to. Meaning, the reason it's loving and it's good to be loving and to help everybody is not because it's good or bad, but it's because the universe is built to function that way, and that we as human beings are built to function that way. It is our nature to do these things, right? So kind of like it's a lion's nature to eat meat. Doesn't mean it's good or bad. It's in its nature. And so sometimes what's in one's nature might be against another person's nature, might seem contradictory, right? So this is where you start having the law of polarity, right? Where you start getting these things that kind of come into conflict with one another, right? But that's the universe. That's what makes it vibrant. This is where you get a law of gender, these opposites creating or having a complementary / contradictory relationship, right? Once again, that's sort of lower thinking. That's like right out of 7th degree, lower 6th degree, right? But as we start ascending, now we're moving into 7th degree law. Now I'm going to try and do, or not 7th, 5th degree law, which will have 7 laws, right? Now the easiest 7 laws of these, and far and away the best, are going to be the law of hermeticism. So this is going to be the law of mind, or mentalism. And you guys are going to see a lot of crossover. So you're going to see the law of correspondence. You're going to see the law of vibration. And what's interesting, you're going to start noticing is that the Hermetic laws are just the universal laws, but the universal laws have been more diversified so they can break down and extrapolate certain concepts. But once you start getting into 5th degree mastery, you don't need all these distinctions. Suddenly what happens is action, transmutation, compensation all just become cause and effect, right? They all just become cause and effect. They all just become that, right? But that's actually later. So once you get into law of vibration, right, then you're going to start going into law of rhythm, pretty sure, rhythm. And the 5th, you're going to go into law of polarity, or actually polarities first, I think. Polarity, and you're going to have rhythm. Then you're going to have cause and effect. And then finally, you're going to have the 7th law, which is gender. Now, it's very interesting because 5th degree law really interacts very powerfully with the entire framework because obviously there's 7 laws, right? So if you can come to an understanding of 5th degree law, that's going to be the clearest picture to understand everything else that I'm saying. And a lot of this is Hermeticism, right? So this is Hermetic, from Hermes Trismegistus, also known as Thoth, also wrote the Emerald Tablets, all this stuff. Is it true? I don't know, but I know these laws work, so just go experiment with them. But we'll talk about what that looks like. Anyway, like and subscribe if any of this is making sense. Put notes or anything you guys are liking or seeing down in the comments. I'm really interested in what your guys' take on all this. I'm trying to figure out one way to to improve the quality of every video. So if you guys give me some feedback, that'll be really great. Okay, so those are the 7 Hermetic laws, which is the basis of 5th degree law, right? So now once we start getting into 5th degree, now we're at 4th degree. This is the last one where it starts not being perfectly aligned, right, with who we are, right? Where there's got to be a bunch of extra, I'll call it extra shit, right? So basically at these laws, they're very difficult to embody fully, right? Because they're naturally complex and they don't naturally align with our being because we are just third degree beings. We're just spirit, mind, and body, right? But we have all these extra laws to understand that pull us away from that. So the last step, which is 5th degree, is basically the law. And so this is, okay, so this is for the second part of the video. Just maybe I'll splice this together. I'll probably split this up in the 2 videos or whatever, because that first one was getting pretty long, but I'm trying to be as thorough as possible because I just want to get this all out so that you guys know what we're talking about as we move forward with all the other lessons and we have like a roadmap of what we're talking about. So what I was saying before is 4th degree law is really about honor and embodiment of all these other laws, right? So the idea is that as we gain a mastery over 7th degree law, we start seeing like, oh, all of this is not really helping me. And then naturally we start coming to an understanding of these laws. And once again, this is all sort of like circular. So you're always going to go up and down, right? It's not just this ladder climb. What happens is oftentimes you'll go here, then you'll learn something here, then you'll go back here, and then you'll go back here. And then slowly but surely you just begin to spiral and progress and then live by higher degrees of law, right? Because you see what works and you see what doesn't. So the idea is figuring out what is a system or a framework that exists as a higher degree of law, and then using that framework to advance. And there's dozens of these frameworks, thousands of these frameworks. Usually they come from pretty inspired people. So a really good example of a 5th degree framework that I really like is the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. I think that's one of the best 5th degree frameworks that is out there. And I think if you do that and you can understand how it moves in conjunction with these, like those habits really do help you gain an understanding of all the laws we're talking about here, just in terms of embodiment, right? So yeah, I really, really like that. But now let's go talking about 4th degree law. We're talking about embodiment and being the thing, right? So I was talking about how part of that, though, it's less of a mental exercise. Like I can tell you these laws, but you know most of this stuff. Once I start getting the 4th degree, you know this stuff. The difficulty is embodying it and then finding ways to actually apply it and ways to strengthen and support your being in doing that. And that's because it's no longer about what you know or what you think. It's really about what you're choosing, right? So you have to come to an understanding of yourself, concrete enough clarity of your own identity to even live by these laws. And that's where understanding and learning these earlier laws help, because then that you begin to get that clarity as you experiment and work with them, right? So I was saying, like, examples of 4th degree law is like Maslow's pyramid is a really good example of like seeing how do we move through that, right? Another example of like really understanding it is our 5 senses: sight, taste, touch, smell, and hearing, right? As well as the platonic solids. I know maybe this is all pretty abstract, but these are all examples of how these things work together, and that by experiencing these senses, by understanding these shapes, and living by this pattern of living, so from survival to safety to relationship to esteem to actualization, you can understand the progress of all things, right? You can understand the progress of all things and recognize that this is all connected with the Hawkins scale. So at the Hawkins scale, the emotions of survival, apathy, guilt, shame, safety. Now we're going into desire, fear, pride. Then you go into relationships, courage, neutrality, willingness, acceptance. Esteem is joy, happiness, and then actualization, peace and enlightenment, right? All that stuff. And so these are all connected, right? And so understanding how the platonic solids and then the 5 elements. So now you have 5 elements of like fire, wind, water, earth, and then void. Or you can call it heart. If you're Captain Planet, he's a hero. Okay, so I actually need to stop writing these things in a weird way. I know I don't write in a straight line, and that's a bad habit. So I'm doing this for you guys because I wanna be clear for you guys. Right? But yeah, so void or like heart, or just the idea of emptiness, right? This is the 5 elements. All this is embodied in the 5th laws. But here we're going to talk about basically the 5 laws, which is the laws of the covenant, which help you embody it. So it's basically the best way to build your honor up. Obedience is obey law. Don't touch fire if you know it's going to burn you. Don't swim in water if you know it's going to drown you. Obey it. Respect things as they are, right? You have to know that there's no morality in these things. There's just obedience. You have to obey. If I want something, I have to give something, right? So that goes into the next one, sacrifice, right? You have to give something up to get something. Sacrifice doesn't necessarily mean you have to struggle or suffer or be in pain. It just means that everything has a cost, right? And that's coming from this idea of transmutation, which we learned here, which comes from polarity and rhythm and vibration, which is this idea that I have to sacrifice something if I want to create a cause to get an effect. So sacrifice. Now, in order to bring all that together, I'm going to call this one the law of the gospel, right? Or essentially the law of grace, right? And grace is that there's a time buffer from the time that you obey a law and sacrifice. There's a time buffer. And you can call this the law of time and space as well. But there's a buffer from the time we choose to obey a law and sacrifice it to the time that we get something, or that something comes out on the other end. Because part of it is testing what we're metal, because it's about embodiment, remember? It's about embodiment. Or I'm going to actually write that down here at the bottom because this is really important. This is about embodiment. So this is about who you are, not about what you think, not about what you believe, not about what you've seen, not about your experiences. None of that matters. It's about who you are, right? And so once you start getting into this level, like when a lot of people are trying to like really get mastery over themselves, they're trying to get here. Because when you get here, this is where the world becomes your bitch. Like you have complete embodiment of all of that, right? But in order to do that, you have to start understanding the law of grace, right? And that's obedience, sacrifice, and then you start understanding and living by the law of grace, which is the third law. And then as you understand the law of grace, in order to work through grace, in order to be like, oh man, I'm working for this thing, but I'm not quite getting what I want, here's why. So, and I'll tell you why grace is important in a second. Well, I'll just tell you right now. Because imagine if you had a thought, and if it was a crappy thought, it instantly happened. Just like you had a good thought and it instantly happened. It would be nice. But, so if you're like, I want $1 million, boom, $1 million pops up on my table. Or I want to have, cute, sexy lady on my bed. She pops out of nowhere, right? But then imagine if every time you had a negative thought, like, oh, that kid is screaming and annoying, I wish they'd just disappear. Or, man, like, I hate that I'm short, I just wish I was taller, or that I lost my legs, or that I got my legs extended, or just some painful, terrible thing happened, or you got angry and you're like, man, I just wish they would shut up and die, or something like that. Every time you had a negative thought, it just instantly happened. The world would be in absolute chaos. So as a result of that, like, we're not able to live or get the results of fourth degree law until we can embody it. And that's why the universe functions the way it does. So in order to speed up your results, you have to be able to understand and gain a mastery of grace. And you do that really at third degree, but you start encountering it here at fourth degree. And so how do you gain mastery over grace, right? Well, that's in two things. First, you're going to have the last one. In order to build esteem, right, you have to stake what's called the law of consecration. Now, to consecrate means to basically put all your energy, eggs, focus, time, and attention on one particular belief set, goals, whatever. You're consecrating yourself, your energy to it. You're consecrating, you're giving yourself to it, right? And then the last one, in order to get actualization, you're going to have what's called the law of chastity. Now, you might be like, chastity? What do you mean? I can't have sex, I can't, go out, or I'm supposed to stay married. Well, no, that's not what we're talking about here. So, but this is an example of it. Marriage was a good example of this. So law of consecration and law of chastity means consecration, let's say I want to build a business. So I'm deciding on this business and I want to build this type of business and this is what I'm going to do. So I've now consecrated myself to this. Some of the earliest examples we had of this was the marriage contract. And so just checking so that the video is going. So we have the consecration, which is where I basically decided I'm going to put myself, my eggs, and everything I'm doing into this because I've decided this is what I'm going to do. Now, chastity means now because I've married this thing, because I am committed to doing this thing, I am not going to deviate. I am not going to look at another hot piece of, booty that walks by, or I'm not going to have a leering eye. I'm not going to commit adultery on this thing that I have obeyed and sacrificed for, that I've consecrated myself to. And so when you think of a life, when you think of your ideal life, it's really like this. The idea is, you're like, well, people think, I've got to believe, I've got to fake it till I make it. No, that's not how it works. It's as simple as this. What are the laws and the rules that you need to live the life you live? Figure out what those laws are, and then obey them. And then sacrifice what is needed to sacrifice. Sacrifice might means I feel crappy. I need to sacrifice my old job. I need to sacrifice my old way of thinking. I need to sacrifice my beliefs. That might not feel good because you're not used to it. You're not comfortable with it, right? But you need to obey the laws of your new life. And then if you sacrifice the laws of your old life, through time, you will be tested with grace. And grace will happen where it'll essentially give you a bunch of options, and the universe will start playing with you and be like, do you really want this? It's just like if you're a dude, you're looking for a girl, can't ever find a girl, no one's interested in it. The minute you get a girlfriend, suddenly all these girls come out of the woodwork. What's happening? Grace. That's exactly what's happening. It's saying, do you really want this? And you might be like, well, those girls are now other options. No, those girls are things from the universe trying to see if you're going to be pulled off your path. That's all it is. And they're going to see, is this what you really want? Are you going to obey and continue the sacrifice, or are you going to waver? And then you'll know when you're actually moving in and stepping into your higher vibration, understanding of these laws, and you're consecrated, when you no longer see the temptation. You're just consecrated. You're chaste. You're married. You're committed. Because you've actually picked something that truly fulfills you, that is in deep alignment with you. And when you do that, when you obey all these laws, you will then naturally start moving into third degree. And when you move into third degree, and now you're in perfect alignment with your being, your mental, and your physical, boom. Then you've done it. Then you're there. Then you're on. Then you're just who you're meant to be. You are in alignment. You are living your values. But it doesn't mean that the journey is over, because then after that, third degree, like we said, we're just due here right under 6th degree. Under third degree, you still have justice, grace, there's that word again, and mercy. And then you basically, as you're living a third degree law to keep advancing, you're just gaining an understanding of what justice, grace, and mercy looks like. And you're just living that over and over and over again. And everything is simplified. Justice, grace, and mercy. Everything is super simplified because your life is in alignment, right? And then your justice is going to be your physical world. Your grace is going to be your mental world. And your mercy is going to be in your spirit. And then the rest, actually, I guess, no, that's right. So, yeah. So, everything's just going to be in your spirit, right? And then you're just going to have everything built off of that, right? Or actually, I guess the Father is, so justice is going to be your physical, I know that. Mercy is going to be the mental, and then grace is going to be spirit. Grace is your spirit. And then once you start living there, you start mastering grace, then you're going to move on to the 2nd degree law, which is basically positive, negative, masculine, feminine. Basically the law of union and energy, right? So union and energy. And you're just going to start seeing everything in ones and zeros, right? Which is like basically the world's a simulation, fucking giant computer. And then you're just going to start seeing everything super, super clear. And then eventually everything is just going to be love. At 1st degree love. And you're just going to feel love all the time. And it's going to be painful. It's exactly what's going to happen. It's going to be super painful. But you'll know, you'll understand, you'll have that clarity. And then whatever narrative you want to create about why all this exists, that's up to you. But that is why reality is the way it is. And if you simply decide you are living here and want to live here, this is the map to how you change it. So, glad you guys made it. It was a long video, but I hope it was clear. Like, subscribe, comment if you guys liked it, if you want to hear more. I'm interested what you guys want me to tackle next. I usually like talking about specific questions to help people understand, because there's so much going on here that I can give a roadmap, but essentially in order to help someone go from one point to the next point, I have to have a question and then have an idea of intention, and then through that it's much easier to build lessons around that. But here's just essentially the roadmap. There's no intent behind it other than just knowing what exactly we're talking about. But as you notice, things tend to get not necessarily simpler, but they're more profound, more deep. And if you didn't understand any of that, let me know, and I'll see if I can break down any specific aspect better. Until then, stay happy, stay healthy. Peace.